everyone, and welcome to another episode of Being at the Quiz is Done. Today we're looking at the Harrying of the North, but before we do that we need to do our Do Now quiz. So pause the video and complete the Do Now quiz. Okay, so as I said, we're studying the Harrying of the North today. It is a case study of William's reaction to a rebellion. We don't actually spend a huge amount of time looking at the rebellion, because to harry somewhere is to carry out a series of attacks. So this isn't the rebellion, it's William's response to the rebellion, his harrying of the North. And this is going to be an importance question. So we're going to be focusing on this area of England around York, the north of England, funnily enough. And this is an area which was historically very difficult for kings of England to control. It was where the Danes had most of their power in the early 11th century, and it remains somewhere that William found very difficult to control. If you think about where the centre of his power is, it's in the southeast of England around London, around London, Pevensey and Hastings, and the further away he gets from Normandy, the further away he gets from that centre of power, the more difficult it's going to be for him to control it. Now this event, the Harrying of the North, appears in the Bayeux Tapestry, which we can see here, and gives us a good hint about what we're going to see during this reading. So you should have your reading either on a PC or printed out, and be aware that it's a very short sheet today. At the end of this reading, we are going to be thinking about why this event was important. What were the consequences of the Harrying of the North? So let's get started. Right, our keywords. An outpost is a small military camp, which is usually a long distance from the main army. A garrison is a group of troops which is stationed somewhere in order to defend it. To harry is to carry out a series of attacks. A chronicler is someone who keeps records of important historical events. So we've already seen a couple of these, men like William of Jumièges, Poitiers, there's William of Malmesbury as well, lots of Williams. A famine is when there is not enough food to feed the population, and to perish is to die in a violent or sudden way. And surprisingly enough, this is another Mark Morris, although for once it's not actually from his book. This is from an article he wrote for BBC History magazine. So I'm just going to move the belt so that I can have the ruler. Let's begin. While the Midlands were tamed through the building of castles, the North was barely affected, with the single castle at York serving as a lone outpost of William's authority. That was about to change when a Frenchman named Robert Cumin was appointed as the new Earl of Northumbria at the start of 1069. The Northumbrians responded by slaughtering him, along with all of his men, then marching south, hoping to retake York. William, who was on one of many trips to Normandy, was forced to rush across the Channel and advance into northern England. After defeating the rebellion, he reinforced York with a second castle. However, the two castles were not enough to save the city, but a third northern rebellion erupted at the end of the summer. This time, the trigger was an invasion by the brother of the King of Denmark. On hearing of the invasion, the leaders of the rebellion from the previous year, who had fled to Scotland, returned to York. Together with the Danes, they seized York, destroyed both of its castles, and put the city's sizable Norman garrison to the sword. Killed them, essentially. When William marched his army north in the autumn of 1069, therefore, it was with the knowledge that his earlier strategy had failed. He must also have been afraid that the Norman conquest was in serious danger of being reversed. Among the rebels was Edgar Atheling, a claimant for the English throne in 1066, and the English earls Edwin and Morcar. As William was struggling to tackle the rebellion in the north, new uprisings broke out both in the West Country and the Welsh border, forcing him to send troops and eventually forcing him to confront the rebels in person. When he returned to Yorkshire in December, he was frustrated to discover that the Danes had returned to their ships in the River Humber and were beyond his reach. So a few things here. First of all, it's important to note that William is getting progressively more desperate. Tried building a castle, it was destroyed. Tried building 2 castles, they were destroyed. Tried fighting the rebels, was forced to move elsewhere. Slowly but surely getting more and more desperate. The second thing to note here is that when it speaks about the Danes returning to their ships, it's not that they're going home, it's that they are essentially staying safe in those ships on the river rather than being attacked by William. Okay. Faced with the prospect of defeat, William decided on a new twofold solution. His first move was to buy off the Danes, promising them a large sum of money and permission to plunder the coast, so to steal from the coast, provided they left in the spring. The next step was to make northern England uninhabitable by subjecting it to merciless harrying. There was a military strategy in this. As another 12th century historian, William of Malmesbury, explains, by destroying everything, the king was ensuring that there would be nothing to sustain the Danish army if they went back on their promise to go home. But as Malmesbury also states, the king also ordered the harrying because he was angry. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of soldiers had been killed at the start of the year in Durham and more recently in York. William, says Orderic, made no effort to restrain his fury. The harrying was an act of vengeance. Now, it's also worth noting, it doesn't mention it here, that this is also a military decision. So these rebels, the non-Danish rebels, refused to face William directly in battle. They hid in marshland and forest, which meant that William was unable to defeat them using a castle. He was unable to face them directly in battle, and so he returned to a tactic that he had used before around London, which was harrying, but as we've seen here, also has that element of frustration and anger and a desire for revenge. From a purely military point of view, the campaign of devastation was a great success. At the start of the new year, William pursued the English leaders of the rebellion as far as the River Tees, where they were forced to submit. The Danes, who predictably failed to lead as promised, were reduced to a miserable diet. And considerable hardship, so much so that when their king arrived in the spring of 1070, he was quickly persuaded to make terms and depart. For the rest of William's reign, there were no further risings in northern England. Edgar Atheling, who fled back to Scotland and then to Flanders in France, eventually made his peace with the king in 1074. But, from a human perspective, the campaign had been appalling. So terrible a famine fell upon the people, wrote English chronicler Orderic Vitalis, that more than 100,000 Christian folk of both sexes, young and old alike, perished of hunger. Another 12th century writer, John of Worcester, reported that people were reduced to eating dogs, horses, cats, and even human flesh. Simeon of Durham, adding to John's account, asserted that the land between York and Durham lay uncultivated for the next 9 years, its deserted villages haunted only by wild beasts and robbers. When we talk about uncultivated, we mean unfarmed. The extent of the human suffering is also confirmed by the Domesday Book, the famous document, the product of a kingdom-wide inquiry into landholding carried out at William's command in 1086. In the pages that covered the northern shires, the word that occurs time and again is waste. The counties with the most waste were those in northern England and the Welsh Marches, harried by William in 1069-70, and also Sussex, which had been ravaged during the Hastings campaign. That is the area in the southeast of England. However, the overwhelming majority of waste was concentrated in Yorkshire, which accounted for more than 80% of the total for all of England. Other shires had recovered their values by the time of the survey, but in Yorkshire, almost 2/3 of all holdings were still described as waste in 1086. Since 1066, the shire had lost more than 80,000 oxen and 150,000 people. Okay, so now we need to think about this question. explain the importance of the harrying of the North. Now, it's really important that we don't fall into the trap of just telling the story of the harrying of the North. It's also really important that we focus on what the harrying of the North actually is, because it wasn't a rebellion and it wasn't the invasion by the Danes. It was William's reaction to the rebellion, and it was William's reaction to the invasion from the Danes. So that's what we need to think about. What are the consequences of William harrying the area around the North? I probably wouldn't include paying off the Danes as such in this, because it's not really harrying, but we can also talk about the Danes within this answer. So pause the video now and then create your spider diagram. Okay, let's just get mine up and put it to one side to make sure that I've covered everything I need to cover. So this has both what you would deem positive and negative consequences from the perspective of William, because this is what we're talking about mainly. From William's perspective, what were the results of this? First and foremost, we need to think about the purpose of this action. We talk about it being an act of vengeance, but primarily this was about trying to stop these frequent rebellions that were happening in the North, and it did. Here we go. For the rest of William's reign, there were no further risings in northern England. And of course you can't see that. There we go. There we go. So this area, which had presented consistent problems for William year on year, has now been reduced to the point where it no longer rebels. So that's going to be our consequence. But of course, we do need to make sure that we emphasise the fact that the North is significant. It's a problem area. Okay. Now, the other problem that William essentially dealt with by harrying the North was that there was a much lower risk of invasion by the Danes. Now, we saw this when we were looking at the claimants for the throne. Some people argued that the only reason that Harold Hardrada invaded in 1066, or generally the only reason that the Danes invaded, was in order to gain wealth or to plunder from England. And by making the north of England a wasteland, it simply becomes unappealing to the Danish army. If they're just there to steal, well, there's not really anything to steal anymore. And if they are there to invade, well, an army runs on its stomach. If the army can't feed itself, it can't stay in a country. And so if you make the north of England wasteland, well, they simply can't feed themselves. So you have a much lower risk of Danish invasion. In fact, the next time we see the Danes getting involved in any way, shape or form is in East Anglia, further down the coast. So let's get on that. With Hereward the Wakes. So East Anglia is down here, so you can see the Danes have essentially stopped invading this area of England and moved down. William's going to be much more able to deal with them in East Anglia, even though the terrain is different, it's still closer to his power base. Okay, so no further rebellions in the north. There's a much lower risk of Danish invasion. We also have the human perspective, the human effect of the harrying of the north, which was the destruction of a huge amount of property, and with that wealth. As a king, really, this is something you probably do want to avoid. because these are taxes which are now not going to be paid. Land that you can't use. So we have the destruction of a huge amount of property, and this links to thousands of deaths and refugees. Dear me, missed that out, didn't I? Refugees, trying to think and write. Okay, so the actual total of deaths is unclear. We have records from the Doomsday Book, we have different historical chroniclers, but we're not 100% sure about how many people actually died. What we do know is that it was a huge number, and those people who didn't die were forced to flee to other areas of England, which we will briefly touch on when we look at Norman towns and villages. In fact, there is a source which you may end up doing as an exam drill, which is allegedly William speaking on his deathbed, in which he pronounced his great shame and how sorry he was that he caused the death of so many innocent people through the harrying of the North. He talks about himself coming down on England like a ravaging lion and causing innocent people to die. So these kind of link together. Our thousands of deaths from refugees, our thousands of deaths and refugees, is one of the key reasons why we get no further rebellions in the North. A, there are relatively few people there to rebel in the first place, and B, this is a really intimidating move. Even by medieval standards, this is violent. So it's a good way for William to demonstrate that he's not that lenient ruler that a lot of people thought he was at the beginning of his reign. And then the destruction of our huge amount of property, that links into our lower risk of Danish invasion. As I said, if people simply don't see the point in plundering, or their army can't survive, then the Danes are much less likely to land on the English coast. So it's an 8-mark question, it's 10 minutes, therefore you need 2 strong paragraphs. I would go with these 2 here. The reason why I wouldn't discuss these as their own paragraphs is because I think there's not really a huge amount to say. You could explain why there were thousands of deaths, and then you would sort of go to that, there were thousands of deaths. Whereas if you view this as a part of the chain of reasoning for this, and you view this as a part of the chain of reasoning for that, then it's going to result in much richer chains and a much higher quality answer. So we've had a look at importance questions a couple of times before this point, so I'm not going to show you a model. 10 minutes on your own, 2 paragraphs, pause the video and write. Okay, once you've written your answer, you then need to email it to me and I'll give you some feedback. Now, you should have already done a feedback lesson on your White Tower answer before this point, which means that we've got quite a few bits of feedback to kind of catch up on. So I'm not sure quite yet whether I'm going to give you videos on all of them, because I want to make sure I keep within your hour. But I also want to make sure you get feedback, so you may just get individualised feedback, you may get feedback and a video. We will cross that bridge when we come to it. Right, our final thing for today, because I've not forgotten for once, is our... No, doesn't like that, does it? There we go. Is our extra reading for today. So if you want to revise this section, it's section 12 of your knowledge organiser. If you want to read further, I've included a link for a History Today article. If you want to watch further, I've included a video. And for that continual revision that you should be doing right now, you should be revising quizzes 27 and 28 from Britain, Health and the People. Send them to me, I'll give you an e-praise point. Okay, thank you very much, have a nice day, and I'll see you next time.